Most misunderstood words in our vocabulary is the word happy. If we could expand that today, it would be the word contentment. An Englishman, not unlike the sounding person that we have in our congregation, Tony Baxter, was touring the U.S. one day, and the Englishman was interviewed about his impressions. And he said, the trouble with Americans is that you are concerned about being so confoundedly happy. Surely there are more important things than just being happy. Now, the nerve of him to say that about us. From the did you know category, I love little historical things that I thought I knew but I didn't know, and that is John Locke actually wrote the original copy, first copy of the Declaration of Independence. You know, the one that talks about the rights of mankind, and the last line was life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and property. But along came Thomas Jefferson, and he wanted it to sound a bit more poetic, and so he said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I don't know that those two things fit together, but the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of something, certainly has a little more grip of it for me. You see, the rub is how in the world do we find this elusive happiness? Ask yourself. When you see all these words about being blessed and bless you and have a blessed day, you know, all the trouble that can cause you, whatever it might be, blessing, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to you to be happy? And if we introduce the word contentment, what is it about contentment that really makes sense to you? So today, really let it roll around in your mind about the issue of happy. Is happy one of those words you put off to the side because happy is light and fluffy, or maybe you need the word contentment? For me, the word is peace. Peace is that word that does not come from external circumstances, but rather it comes from an attitude, an outrageous attitude, if you would, to maintain about life. My experience with this whole thing is that typically there are different strokes for different folks. I mean, think about it. Some people like the city, some people like the country. Some people work hard, invest wisely, and others don't work at all and want public assistance. Some folks choose to be a nun, others choose to be a prostitute, something in between there. Some choose to be a brain surgeon, and others may be a pimp. Now, I'm taking the extremes, obviously, but those are the things that attract us toward do what we do and therefore seek a certain level of peace, happiness, and contentment. So, do you have a right? Is it your right to be happy? Is it a qualified right, although it is not an absolute one? Alton McEachin, who has written a book on the Beatitudes, he has an incredibly sad story of one of his parishioners that came to him, and she had met a man. Evidently, she had been widowed or divorced or whatever, but she had a fairly small child at the time, and she met this incredibly wealthy man. But that wealthy man had some quirks, and one of the quirks was a fairly significant one, and that was that he didn't like children. Okay, she had a child, and that was a problem, as you might expect. So literally what she did, and he had a conversation that, again, as I read it back again last night, I really couldn't even wrap my brain around it. Well, she chose to let the child live with somebody else. And for all those years, she kept coming back to him for counseling, and she finally hit the punchline one day when she said to him, "Don't I have a right to be happy?" And his response was, "Of course you do. It's just, what will you pay in order to be happy? And by the way, are you happy now?" And of course she wasn't. We have a right. I would fight for the right for you to pursue the right to happiness, but not happiness at all cost. The word blessed is an interesting word. Makarios is the Greek word, and it means blessed or happy or oh how happy or you are to be congratulated. And the one that we used last week was God has a tender place in his heart for those of you who are blessed and happy and all those kinds of things. So if you got your folder, want to follow along, we're going to look at the whole issue of contentment. First of all, our view of contentment. Psychology Today a number of years ago interviewed 52,000 Americans, were asked the question, and most of the attempts to find happiness was not surprisingly through external things instead of internal things. And so the popular idea for most of us as we encounter the issue of the question of happiness is that having the right set of circumstances. If you left today, what would it be in your circumstances that you would change, and because of changing that thing in those circumstances, you would believe it would increase your happiness, it would increase your contentment? Somebody has called it the when and then thinking. You know, when and then. I've used this numerous times in my life. It's when I get out of school. I remember saying that to God numerous times when I was in graduate school. God, I am smart enough, surely by now. I am smart enough by now. I just need to move on. I mean, I loved school. I enjoyed it. But I thought in my mind, oh, I can't wait to get out of school and then I'll be happy. Do you know that you have to study after you get out of school? I don't know if you know that or not, but every week is a study exam for me. And there was, when I get my first full-time job, while I was in seminary, I had 3 jobs typically, all running at the same time. And when I get a job, then I'll be happy. And then how about when I get married? Surely that happened for me. I just need to tell you that right off the bat. There was no problems after I got married, but you have that idea of somewhere along the way when you cross a certain threshold that it will in fact make you happy. And then there was the foolish thought that when I have kids, I would be happy. And then that foolish thought has left my mind numerous times. And then when the kids leave home, then I'll be happy. I am really believing that one right now. I just got to tell you that. When the kids leave home, I will be happy. The classic chapter in this search is found in Ecclesiastes 2. You remember Solomon, he said, I have decided to enjoy myself and to find out what contentment really is. And he did, didn't he? So we view our contentment in these categories. First of all, by accumulating things. We call this one the furniture. By accumulating things. I guess you know where I am in my life now when I'm talking about VeggieTales, but VeggieTales has this unique video where it talks about the attraction of the Stuff Mart. There might be a playoff of some other organization there, but I'm not sure. And in that little video, it talks about living in the world of of things, and the value of all the things that we can clutter our lives with. If you've lived long enough, then you know that there is this point in time when you say maturity is deciding to get my needs met and not worrying so much about my wants. And that is a uniquely significant time in your life when you can move from just saying, I want all my wants met, and I can now reduce myself down to needs. I would encourage you to take a room that you need to declutter and have that as your filter through which you look. Matter of fact, I would encourage you to do that with your garage sometime. How many tools do we have there that we want, that someday we might use? I will tell you that I have none. I don't want to ever use any of those tools ever again. I've made that decision. I will probably be using some of them this week. But there are just some things that you want as opposed to the things that you need. You remember the multi-million billionaire Howard Hughes. His story is certainly well known. Somebody asked him one day, how much does it take to make a man happy? You know what he said? Well, just a little bit more. And lots of people live their lives with that in mind. Accumulating things or the furniture. Secondly, we view our contentment in terms of experiencing pleasures, and that is that we escape. We escape. Now, in Jesus' time, there was a group called the Essenes. The Essenes they built a monastery in Qumran, which is in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea. You may remember something about the Dead Sea Scrolls. They believed that politics and that Jewish religion of their day was so corrupt that they gave up on both. They were sitting around with their arms folded, expecting Jesus to come back soon, and so they gave their life to prayer and rigid discipline. I met recently a Greek Orthodox monk, and that's a mouthful, let me just tell you. Father Andrew is a unique guy, and if you've ever watched the 60 Minutes piece on Mount Athos, which is, you got to see this thing to believe it. That's where he is a monk, but he travels literally all over the United States because he is the executive director for the St. Paul Foundation. And Father Andrew's a unique bird. When I began to get to know him a little bit, and he asked me to tell him about myself, we have a whole set of words he's never heard when I talked about accepting Christ, and I was from an unchurched background, and that I was rebirthed heathen, and those words are foreign to him. This whole unchurched thing is just, but basically what they do is there is a certain separation. If Father Andrew was in the room today, everybody in the room would pick him out. Why? Because he always wears black. Matter of fact, it's going to be the same thing he wore yesterday, probably, because he didn't have a lot of clothes. Father Andrew lives pretty slim. I think he told me the Volvo that he was driving was 17 years old. But he did have an iPhone. I noticed that. So I was intrigued by that. No, he has to communicate because that's part of what he does. He's oftentimes on Capitol Hill doing some things. And the Greek Orthodox are an interesting group, and we'll talk more about them. But what I noticed about them was their isolation from the world. They have a strong belief in the isolation of the world. Franklin D. Roosevelt used to tell the story of his friend Jeb. I love this story. He said Jeb was going deaf, and that the doctor told Jeb to stop drinking, that was not helping him. And Jeb thought for a moment, and he said, "Doc, I like what I've been drinking so much more than what I've been hearing that I reckon I'll just keep on going deaf, if you would be." Now, let me help with that a little bit. But there are moments in my life where I don't like what I'm hearing. And I talked in our Sunday school class this morning about this whole fiasco that is called the National Football League. And I'm not going to get on that. I'll probably write an article or two and let you hear my perspective on that. But my frustration is that, do you not see? Have you not heard what that is that you are doing to our world? When money trumps morality, there's always going to be problems. It's just that simple. And in this particular reference about experiencing pleasure by escaping, I am a sports fan. You know that. You know that my heart is heavy this morning because the clock was on 0 last night. Just for those of you who do not know what I'm talking about. It was on 0. The game was done, folks. But I didn't take it personally. I moved right on from it. It has not affected me in my ability to preach this morning. But there is in this world this escape that is frightening to me, and certainly we've seen parts of that this week. In 1991, everything changed about this issue. What happened in 1991? Anybody tell me? The internet. The internet exploded on our world, and do you know I can get anything on my screen I want to get on my screen? You can find anything. And if you are in this world for pleasure, then my friend, that little square thing in front of you will take you to your knees. I can't tell you the number of pastors I know who have fallen because of pornography addiction. It's based on the premise, if it feels good, surely it must be fine. So if we adapt this escape, then it's awfully easy just to come to church and check our church duty off and then go into our world and just play escape for the rest of the week. That's called fortress faith, where you and I just kind of say, oh, the world's bad, I'm good with God, and therefore I will build a fortress around me and allow God and me to get along really, really well. And that's my fortress. But then there is this other kind of faith, and it's called salt and light faith, and that is radically different. Salt and light is penetrating. It's in the world, and it's doing something. It's making a difference. It's not escaping. So there is the furniture, there is the escape, and thirdly, achieving success. We view our contentment through achieving success, and we listen for the applause, and that's the prostitution of our lives to view of success that is built on applause and opinion. I will tell you that as a pastor, I live with this reality. And you do too, where you work, where you we all live with a certain level of who it is that we want to hear clap for us and what it is that their clapping matters to us. And sometimes it is not a pleasant place to be. Because sometimes to lean toward the applause is to leave from our convictions. And if we're not careful, that's what will happen. So there is this constant battle, I think, between dealing with the convictions and dealing with the applause that holds us in tension to do what matters. Our new mission statement, should you approve it in the final product that's called the Strategic Leadership Team Report, is love God, serve others, and share your story. In that setting there is this thing about love God, serve others, share your story. Who is it that we're listening for applause? It looks like loving God leads into serving others and then sharing our story. And it seems like God's the only constant in all three of those that we lean into for the applause. Fourthly, we view our contentment in terms of giving in. Absolutely nowhere. There is no contentment to be found. Solomon certainly thought that in Ecclesiastes 2:17. He says, all of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Now, there are those who say that happiness is found nowhere, absolutely nowhere, that these persons point to the apparent contradictions that we live in our lives all the time. For instance, we are made for community, but we are always lonely. We are made to be loved, but love is so fickle, it can't be depended on. We are created for dignity, and yet we are ashamed of ourselves. And I would certainly admit that the NFL needs a little more shame in their repertoire. We are made for a relationship with God, and we try to be God. And so where we get all of that is the Stoics of the Greek times. I went back and looked at the fellow who began to first talk about Stoicism, and his name was Zeno. Imagine that, from Athens. And in Jesus' day, it was basically grin and bear it. It was stoic. It was simply life is something to be endured. Contentment is a bridge between what I am and what I was meant to be. And there are those who say it's impossible to have. So let's get on to something that I think will be helpful, not just what it is, and that is the popular idea of contentment is having the right set of circumstances, but let's talk about God's view of contentment. Matthew 5, the one that we're looking at, the Sermon on the Mount lasts for some 2 chapters here, but we're going to look at the Beatitudes, the outrageous attitudes. And here Jesus has 8 positive, overwhelmingly outrageous attitudes that he talks about. And so today the point of these outrageous attitudes is that my contentment will never and is not determined by what is happening around me, but rather it will be determined by what is happening in me. In other words, contentment will always be a choice. It is a choice that you and I make. So the first step to outrageous contentment, what is it? It's being empty-handed. That's our first outrageous attitude. Matthew 5:3, my translation goes like this. God has a tender place in his heart for the empty-handed, for they shall experience the reality of God's kingdom. So what does it mean to be empty-handed? It means to depend on God. It means admitting that I do not have it all together, to admit that I have not yet arrived, and I'm realizing that I haven't learned everything, and that I'm not the sum total of the universe, that I, in fact, am not perfect, and I stand in need of completion. So being empty-handed, first of all, will reduce the stress in my life. When I'm empty-handed, it reduces the amount of stress that's in my life. I don't have to have all the answers. I realize the world does not depend on me all by myself. I can resign as the general manager of the universe. Now, I know that's news to some of you, but I want to give you that news today. You can resign today as the general manager, not only of the universe, but of your particular world as well. I don't have to fake it. You don't have to play God. You don't have to be perfect. The fact is, there is always going to be a tension between the real and the ideal. There's always going to be a tension between what I want to be and what I am. I know that. We live with that tension because we are, in fact, this side of heaven. But the fact is, we take ourselves too seriously. What I mean by that is we take ourselves so seriously that we feel like we have to control everything around us. We are control merchants. If we're not careful, we will attempt to control most everything around us. Why? Because it helps us feel safe. Secondly, we being empty-handed means not only reducing stress, but it improves relationships. Anybody here like somebody who knows everything? Anybody here like to be around a person who is incredibly humble? They don't try to impress you. They don't have to be one up on you. Being empty-handed doesn't mean that you think less of yourself. It simply means that you think more about other people. The fact is that when you're becoming interested in other people, you will also become interesting to them. Have you ever noticed that? The more interested you are in another person, the more interesting you end up being to that person. You don't have to be right all the time. There are great words like, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I need your help. I tried to go back and find the exact source of this, and I know it was somewhere around Brother, Sun, Sister Moon. If you remember that movie, it was about my brother, St. Francis. He and I are very close. And there was a I'm kidding there, just so some of you go home and say, I did not know that about him. But St. Francis, his life was in a movie, and it was called Brother, Sun, Sister Moon. And within that, again, I read it, and then I went back and reread. I couldn't find the exact location of where I found it, but it says when someone praised him in his training at the monastery, he had a particular monk who would follow him around and remind him of all his faults. And they asked him why, and it says, because you will never be married, you need somebody to help you do that. I read that. I really did read that. Now let me balance that by saying it was never God's job of any pastor's wife, Christian's wife, to be their boss. I love how Ruth Graham used to say it. She says, my job is to love Billy. God's job is to keep him humble. And that's worked pretty well for them, hasn't it? Being empty-handed means it reduces stress in your life, it improves relationship, and ultimately it releases God's power in your life. And that's the best part, isn't it? When you come to God empty-handed, He can fill your hands. When you come to God full of all of your stuff, and you're holding on to all of your stuff, it's awfully hard for Him to breathe His power in and through your life. The Bible says that the secret of spiritual power is to walk humbly with God and to realize that you absolutely have to depend on Him. James 4:6, God gives strength to the humble, but He sets Himself against the proud. You know what the Hebrew word for salvation, literally, its root means? The root word for salvation in Hebrew is to make room. And that is a great definition of salvation. Think about it. It is not possible to walk with God without, first of all, making room. Making room is an absolute necessity for walking with God and doing anything. I'm not a Star Trek person. I know that it makes me look small in some of your eyes. I know that. Some of you are Trekkies. I mean, you take that seriously. You probably line up in those outfits and you love that. I never have gotten into that much, but I have noticed that they had that saying, the final frontier, outer space, the final frontier. I thought of that a number of years ago when I went to Carlsbad Caverns. If you've ever been into a really cavernous place, that's where you go down and down and down until you see the center of the world. I mean, it's way, way down there. Of course, they light this little path, and then they get you down there, and they say, poof, and they turn out all the lights. And that's when I found myself holding on to Neva really, really tight until the lights came back on, and I looked cool again. But there are those moments when, in that setting, you feel like you're in this space. Well, I tell that because I didn't ever see this one, but I'm told, a buddy of mine told me about, he used to pastor a church in Georgetown, Texas, That's a central Texas hill country. And there they advertise on a highway sign about the caverns that are there. It said, explore inner space. Not outer space, but explore inner space. When you think about it, it's a good name, isn't it? When we let God into our inner space, that's when we begin to sense contentment. That's where we begin to sense God's power in our lives. Jesus said, John 13:17, now that you know the truth, how contented you will be if you put it into practice. One of my favorite stories is the story of a son of a rabbi who came to his father and said, I don't like those kids that I'm playing hide and seek with. He says, why? And he was tearful. He says, because when I hide, they won't come looking for me. I don't like them. You think about that for a moment, that would not be a pleasant thing as a child. And then his father said a really, really important thing. He said, that's good. Maybe now you can understand God. The pain of God when no one comes looking for him has to be an awful thing. Why? Because coming to look for God always demands that we come empty-handed. Maybe that's why we don't come. Or maybe that's the only time we come. We come because we couldn't figure it out ourselves. So we drop all that we're holding on to and we say, oh, I get it now. You mean I need to drop something? I need to empty my cavern. I need to let God into my inner space in order to see what this outrageous attitude about being poor in spirit really means. It says that those who are poor in spirit will receive, get this, the kingdom. It would be good enough if it just said kingdom of God, but what is it? It says the kingdom of heaven. Now, I don't know what you think and know about heaven, but what I think and know about heaven is really, really good. Because I've known enough people who've taken this cavernous space in their lives and have let God fill it. And then at the end of their lives, you know what I see? I see them looking at God. Some of you may have received an email late last night from the Peters family. It's a long email. But the trail of that email is one word: God is enough. That once he fills the cavern of your life, he will always be enough. I want to live with that certainty in my life, don't you? If you're here and you've not had that cavern filled, and you want today for God to fill that cavern, that inner space. If you're here and you don't have any sense of contentment in your life, but you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God offers that,